The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical song as Margaret Walsh pushed through the employee entrance at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston, her silver hair pinned back in a style she'd worn for 15 years. 2 in the morning. The night shift stretched ahead of her like an open hand, familiar and predictable. She clocked in without looking at the time stamp, already moving toward the 4th floor where her patients waited in their semi-darkness, monitors beeping soft arithmetic in the sterile quiet. Her shoes made no sound on the linoleum. 14 years she'd learned that trick, the way to move through a hospital without drawing attention, without the squeak of rubber soles that made people's heads turn. She'd been practicing invisibility long before she took this job. Invisibility was a skill. Like everything else, it required discipline. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the plastic sweetness of vending machine donuts no one had eaten. Margaret hung her coat on the 3rd hook from the left, the same hook she used every night, and pulled out the patient charts for rooms 412, 415, and 419. Her hands were steady as she opened the first folder, a post-op coronary bypass, day 2, vital stable, but she'd want to check the peripheral perfusion herself in 20 minutes. The chart said everything was fine. Her instinct said to verify. She didn't notice her hands trembling until she reached for the 2nd file. Just fatigue. Just the weight of 15 years accumulating in her shoulders like sediment. The tremor was small, barely visible, but she caught it in the corner of her vision and forced her breathing into the pattern she'd learned in 2003, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The trembling stopped. By the time she lifted her eyes from the chart, her hands were steady again. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled back into their fluorescent hum. Margaret had learned long ago that hospitals were like military forward operating bases. Everyone had their role, their rank, their invisible hierarchy. The residents deferred to the attending physicians. The attending physicians deferred to the surgeons. The surgeons answered to the chief. And the nurses? The nurses kept everything running in the spaces between the hierarchy, invisible, indispensable, unnoticed. Margaret had built her life in those spaces. She was reviewing the lab results for her bypass patient when the footsteps came down the hallway. Different footsteps. Expensive shoes, the kind that clicked against linoleum with deliberate precision. New shoes. Designer soles that had never walked a hospital floor at night before. Margaret didn't look up from her charts, but she tracked the sound through the walls, past the ICU, toward the trauma bays, then up the stairwell toward her floor. Someone new. Someone important enough to announce himself with footsteps instead of silence. The door to the 4th floor unit swung open at 2:16 a.m., and Dr. Hargrove entered as if he'd been waiting for an applause that hadn't been scheduled. His name badge was so new the laminate gleamed under the overhead lights. Chief of Surgery. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly car payment, and he moved through the unit like a man who had already decided he owned the place. His eyes were the color of cold water. The kind of eyes that saw people as obstacles or assets, nothing in between. Margaret continued reading her charts. She could feel him scanning the floor from the entrance, the nursing station, the patient rooms, the staff moving through the corridors at their practiced midnight pace. She didn't need to look to know his expression. She'd seen it before on plenty of men in better uniforms. The look of someone calculating which corners could be cut and who would complain about it. The look of someone who'd already decided the rules were for lesser people. When his gaze landed on her, she felt it the way you feel a shift in air pressure. She turned another page in the chart and made a notation with her pen. Slow. Deliberate. Not ignoring him. Just working. Just being the quiet nurse in the break room at 2:53 in the morning, exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Dr. Hargrove didn't move toward her. Instead, he turned and walked toward the nearest patient room. Room for 15. The bypass patient. Margaret had seen it happen 100 times, new administrators making rounds late at night, trying to find inefficiencies, looking for nurses making mistakes they could document and weaponize. He was checking. She heard him open the chart. She heard the soft intake of breath as he scanned the vitals, the intake and output log. She heard the clinical precision of someone looking for a flaw. And then she heard footsteps again, moving back down the hallway, and then she heard his voice for the first time, addressing a resident near the nursing station. "Who's taking care of 415? Not a question. A demand for accountability." "That's Nurse Walsh," the resident said. Margaret recognized the voice. David Chen, second-year resident, good instincts, still learning to trust them. "She's excellent with post-op cardiac. She caught a dropped potassium last month that would have." "I didn't ask for a character reference," Hargrove said. "I asked who was responsible." The hallway went quiet in that particular way hospitals go quiet when power has just been asserted in a corner where nobody expected it. Margaret turned another page in her chart. In through the nose. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth. The tremor in her hands was gone now, replaced by something older and more familiar. Muscle memory. The kind that didn't require thought. For the first time in 15 years, Margaret Walsh felt something shift inside her, a door opening on a part of her past she'd spent a decade and a half sealing shut. But she kept her eyes on the charts. She kept her breathing steady. She kept her hand still on the laminated paper in front of her, and she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge that Dr. Hargrove had just declared war in his quiet, calculating way. The night shift continued. At 3:15 a.m., Margaret walked into room for 15 with her for pump in one hand and a site assessment kit in the other. The bypass patient was sleeping, an older gentleman named Robert Chen, no relation to the resident, and his chest rose and fell with the mechanical precision of post-operative recovery. She moved with the fluid competence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. She checked the central line, assessed the site for any sign of infection, verified the line placement, and made a note on the chart: site clean, no erythema, patient tolerating lines well. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly as it should be. But as she was turning to leave the room, something caught the corner of her vision. A photo on the bedside table. An old photograph in a frame decorated with fresh flowers. An 8-year-old boy with dark eyes and a bright smile, standing next to what looked like a schoolhouse with concrete walls. Margaret's hands went still. The photograph was from Baghdad. She knew that without knowing how she knew. That exact style of concrete, that exact schoolhouse, that exact light. 2004, Jolon District. The memory moved through her like a blade. The fire. The sound of the explosion was still echoing through the streets, still vibrating in the window panes. She was third platoon, running toward the smoke instead of away from it, her medical bag slapping against her ribs, her boots hitting the rubble. The schoolhouse had been collapsed into itself, children's desks scattered like kindling, and there, half buried under a concrete slab, a boy. 8 years old. Maybe 9. His name was Amir. His eyes were open but not seeing. His pupils were fixed and dilated. No pulse. No breath. Gone. But Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had done 13 minutes of pediatric resuscitation on rubble in a city that was actively trying to kill her. 13 minutes of chest compressions on a boy whose ribs felt like bird bones under her hands. 13 minutes of rescue breathing through her own exhaustion, her own thirst, her own terrified understanding that she was holding someone's child and that child was already dead, had been dead, was going to stay dead. And then his eyes moved. Just once. Just a flutter of the pupil toward hers. The faintest gasp of air, pulling down into lungs that had forgotten how to work. She pulled her hands back. The boy was still alive. Barely. Barely enough to keep going. Barely enough to keep fighting. Barely enough. Margaret pulled her focus back to the present moment. To room for 15. To the photograph on the bedside table of an 8-year-old boy with dark eyes and a bright smile, a boy who was supposed to be dead and wasn't. She stared at that photograph for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and left the room, and she did not allow herself to think about what she had just seen. She walked back to the break room and sat down with the remaining charts. In through the nose. For counts. Hold. For counts. Out through the mouth. Her hands were trembling again. Dr. Hargrove was still on the unit. She could hear him asking questions in that careful, surgical voice of his. Not demanding. Not yet. Just asking. Just verifying. Just establishing the parameters of his dominion and testing to see who would push back. He had been chief of surgery for less than 48 hours, and already he was remaking the fourth floor in his image, efficiently, carefully, with the kind of precision that would be impossible to challenge because it never raised its voice. Margaret Walsh had spent 15 years being invisible. Had spent 15 years moving through hospitals the way soldiers move through hostile territory, head down, mission-focused, never drawing fire. Had spent 15 years burying a woman who had once carried a medical bag and a rifle and had done both with equal competence. That woman was supposed to stay buried. But there was a boy, a man now, she realized with a kind of shock, walking the same hallway she walked, breathing the same recycled hospital air she breathed. A boy she had brought back from the dead with her hands. A boy who had lived when he wasn't supposed to live. A boy who had become a doctor, an actual doctor, at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston, the same hospital where Margaret Walsh took her night shifts and tried to be invisible. And now a man like Dr. Hargrove had arrived to teach her that invisibility was a privilege, not a right. That it could be revoked at any moment by someone powerful enough to revoke it. That she had been seen the moment she walked through those hospital doors 15 years ago, and the only thing that had protected her was her usefulness. She closed the chart and placed it carefully on the break room table. The night shift was only halfway done. Dawn was still 4 hours away. The night shift was only halfway done. Dawn was still 4 hours away. Room 318 lay quiet at 2:15 a.m., the only sound the steady hiss of the 4-pump running saline into Mr. Chen's arm. Margaret stood at his bedside reading his latest labs, the white blood cell count screaming at her from the screen, 19,000. His fever had spiked to 101.8 at midnight. Sepsis. The kind that whispered to you softly before it screamed. He needed another 48 hours minimum, maybe 72. The antibiotics were just beginning to work. His wife sat in the corner chair, exhausted, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. Margaret had seen this pattern 300 times. She knew it the way a sailor knows a storm coming across dark water. The door opened at 2:48 a.m. Dr. Hargrove filled the doorway like a man accustomed to rooms shrinking when he entered. His white coat was pristine, his tie silk, his watch probably worth more than Margaret made in 6 months. He hadn't been on the floor in 96 hours. When he appeared at 2:53 a.m. on a Wednesday, it was never good news. Nurse Walsh. Not hello. Not even good morning. Just her name, spoken the way a man might say a curse word. Margaret looked up from the chart. Her hands remained steady. Doctor. Mr. Chen is being discharged today. I've already signed the orders. He didn't come to the bedside. He stood in the doorway, managing distance like he managed authority, from a place where accountability couldn't reach. We need this bed for admissions. The unit is at capacity and my metrics don't accommodate inefficiency. Margaret felt Mrs. Chen's body tense beside her. She felt the temperature of the room drop 2 degrees. She set the chart down with deliberate care, each movement chosen and controlled, the kind of control that comes from having once held the neck artery of a boy dying in a Baghdad schoolhouse while mortar rounds tore the walls apart. Doctor, his white count is still 19,000 and his febrile. Her voice was steady. Her voice was always steady. Early discharge would compromise his recovery. He needs another 48 hours minimum for antibiotics. The clinical indicators are clear. Hargrove's mouth tightened into something that might have been a smile if smiles could cut. Are you a physician, Grandma? The word hung in the air like poison gas. Did you go to medical school while I wasn't looking? Your limited medical knowledge doesn't override my clinical judgment. This is my unit now, and we run it on results, not sentiment. The word Grandma. Not Margaret. Not even Nurse Walsh. Grandma, delivered with the precision of a man who had studied where to place the knife. Mrs. Chen made a small sound, something between a gasp and a moan. Mr. Chen's eyes opened, confusion clouding his features as the fever held him in its grip. Margaret took one measured breath. She had taken measured breaths in places where one unmeasured breath meant death. She looked directly at Hargrove, and something shifted behind her eyes, a single moment where the nurse fell away and something else showed through, something that recognized combat when it arrived dressed in a silk tie. Efficiency that kills patients isn't efficiency, doctor. Her voice had dropped. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that makes people lean in, the kind that comes from absolute certainty. It's negligence. And negligence is a choice. The room went dead silent. The ventilator in room 317 wheezed. The hallway clock ticked. Outside the window, Houston slept. Hargrove's face flooded red, but he smiled that terrible smile again. Write it up as insubordination. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing like gunshots down the tile corridor. Margaret stood alone with the Chens. She didn't look down. She didn't look away from where he had been. Mrs. Chen was crying quietly. Mr. Chen had already slipped back under the fever's weight. Margaret adjusted the flow rate, checked the antibiotic infusion one more time, then documented everything in the chart with the precision of a woman building evidence. 23 years and 4 months of nursing experience. 3 tours of medical work in combat zones. 214 lives resuscitated. All of it worth less, apparently, than Dr. Hargrove's bed metrics. The break room at 3:11 a.m. held 6 people when she entered. Margaret poured coffee into her cracked mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, and sat at the table beside Nurse Patel. The smell of burnt coffee and old microwave popcorn hung in the stale air. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 3:33 a.m. He didn't speak. He just stood there, and his presence changed the air pressure in the room the way a drop barometer changes everything. Nurse Patel stood up. She didn't look at Margaret. She just left. Then Nurse Chen stood. Then Nurse Rodriguez, the youngest one, the one Margaret had trained personally, who had asked her 3 weeks ago how to handle a difficult family conversation. Rodriguez stood without meeting her eyes and walked out. One by one. 7 people. Exiting like water draining from a bathtub, the silence growing heavier with each departure until Margaret sat alone at the table, her hands wrapped around the cracked mug, watching her reflection in the black coffee. She stayed seated for 2 minutes. Not 1. Not 3. 2. Then she stood, left the mug on the table, and returned to work. Her hands were steady. Her step was measured. The trembling, if it came, would wait for a place where no one could see it. Room 318. Room 319. Room 320. The medications came from the supply room on schedule. The vitals were documented. The chart notes appeared at the correct times, each one a small rebellion of competence, a statement in ink and timestamp that said, "I am still here. I am still doing this. I am still watching." At 4:15 a.m., Hargrove posted the write-up on the unit bulletin board in the medication room where everyone could see it. Not in an office. Not in a private meeting. On the board, where the whole night shift would find it before breakfast. The text was printed in Helvetica, centered, official-looking. The hospital letterhead at the top made it seem important, made it seem like this was a matter of record. Nurse Margaret Walsh, written warning, insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. Questioning physician orders in front of patients and families. Undermining departmental authority. Further incidents will result in immediate termination. No mention of Mr. Chen's rising fever. No mention of the lab values. No mention of what efficiency had meant or what it had cost. Just the accusation, printed and permanent, as if cruelty required documentation. Margaret read it at 5:16 a.m., during the shift transition when the medication room was crowded. She felt 3 sets of eyes on her, younger nurses, fresh out of their programs, watching to see how she would crack. How the system worked. How it broke people. She touched the paper once. Her hand was steady until it wasn't. A slight tremor, barely perceptible, like a seismograph detecting something miles away. Then she turned away from the board and from the watching eyes, and she walked to the supply closet at the end of the corridor. The one where people stored empty 4 bags and old equipment. The one no one monitored. She closed the door and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds. 1 breath. 2. The tears came like rain, like the rain in Baghdad at dawn, like the rain she hadn't permitted herself in 20 years. 30 seconds. 1 tear for the boy in the schoolhouse. 1 for the 7 people who had left the break room. 1 for the write-up on the bulletin board. 1 for the accumulating weight of keeping everything locked behind a uniform that nobody understood. At 31 seconds, she stopped crying. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She straightened her scrubs. She checked her reflection in the darkened window of the equipment cabinet. Her eye contact with herself was steel. The nurse looked back at her, unchanged. She opened the door and returned to work. Room 318. The night shift continued. The machines beeped their mechanical rhythm. The 4 pumps hissed. The floors remained clean and the medications remained precise, and Mr. Chen's fever would begin to break in approximately 40 hours, and Margaret would be there to see it, to chart it, to prove that early discharge would have killed him. The evidence would be documented. The responsibility would be clear. But Hargrove was already making calls. At 6:15 a.m., he sat in his office with the door closed, his phone pressed to his ear. He was calling board members whose daughters his ex-wife knew. Board members who had connections to people with money. Board members who understood how to protect their investments. He spoke in careful language, no accusations, just concerns. Just questions about staff retention protocols and the advisability of keeping nurses who challenged institutional authority. Just suggestions that some people, no matter how experienced, sometimes develop personality disorders that compromise judgment. The calls lasted until 6:51 a.m. By then, Margaret had finished her final medication rounds. The handoff report was documented. The night shift was over. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, her hands moving through the familiar motions: remove badge, remove hospital ID, fold the blue scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and other people suffering. The hallway to the exit was quiet at 7:04 a.m. The day shift was arriving, the night shift departing, the hospital operating on that fine edge between darkness and light where Margaret had spent the last 15 years. As she walked toward the parking lot, Dr. Hargrove emerged from the stairwell 3 feet ahead of her. He saw her approaching. He didn't move. He simply waited, blocking her path, his silk tie glinting under the fluorescent lights. Margaret stopped. They stood 3 feet apart. The hallway was empty. The early morning light was pale, almost colorless. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Not louder. Something else had changed. Something deeper. The kind of change that comes when a person decides they have nothing left to lose except the truth. Cruelty dressed as efficiency still smells like cruelty, doctor. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Hargrove's face flushed. His jaw clenched. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the distant recognition of a threat he didn't understand. "Are you threatening me, Nurse Walsh?" His voice had sharpened. "Because if you're threatening..." "I'm not threatening anyone." Margaret's eye contact was absolute. "I'm telling you what I see." She walked past him. He didn't move. He stood in the hallway as Margaret pushed through the exit doors into the Houston morning, where the sun was rising over the parking lot and the day was already hot, already demanding, already carrying the weight of every choice that had been made in the darkness. Behind her, in the hallway, Dr. Hargrove stood very still, understanding, for the first time, that he had made a serious mistake. The overhead speaker crackled at 3:53 a.m. Security alert, ER entrance, all available personnel respond. Margaret's hands froze mid-stock, a box of saline bags suspended above the cart in room for 12. The voice that came through next made her entire body go rigid. That scream. That voice. She knew that voice, but impossibly older, terrified, human. Dr. Amir Hassan. The resident. The one she'd been watching across the hospital cafeteria for 3 weeks, seeing something familiar in his eyes, something she'd buried so deep she thought it would never surface again. She moved without deciding to move. The ER doors exploded inward like they'd been hit by a truck. A man. Massive. 250 pounds of muscle and psychosis and something chemical burning through his veins. PCP. Margaret could smell it, that acrid chemical rot mixed with sweat and desperation. His eyes weren't focusing on any single point. They were wild, dilated, locked in a state that didn't register pain or fear or consequence. In his right hand, a tire iron. In his left, he had Dr. Hassan by the throat. Dr. Hassan's feet kicked at the linoleum. His face was already turning purple. The color of oxygen deprivation. The color of 30 seconds until consciousness ended. His hands clawed at the man's forearm but made no difference. The grip was absolute. Around them, the ER staff froze. Doctors. Nurses. A respiratory therapist. All of them backing up, creating space, following the ancient animal instinct that says distance equals safety. Security was scrambling from the far side of the department, but they were 30 feet away. Too far. Too slow. Margaret covered 15 feet in 2 seconds. Her muscle memory didn't ask permission. It didn't consult with a 60-year-old woman in blue scrubs who had spent 15 years pretending to be someone small. Her body remembered Baghdad. Her body remembered the training facility at Dam Neck. Her body remembered what she was. What she had always been underneath the quiet voice and the careful bedside manner and the way she made herself small in every room. She struck the nerve cluster behind the intruder's left elbow, not a punch but a precise, directed blow to the radial nerve. The grip on Dr. Hassan's throat loosened for exactly 1/2 second. That was all she needed. Her right hand caught his wrist and rotated, using his own mass against him, his momentum becoming her tool. His body wanted to move in one direction. She simply changed the direction it was moving. The tire iron fell. His center of gravity inverted. He was airborne for a breath. He hit the linoleum hard enough to hear the wind knock out of him. The sound was like a bag of wet concrete dropping from a roof. Margaret followed him down, her left knee settling onto his spine with the precise weight of someone who had done this exactly right. Her hands found the pressure points at his neck and shoulder, the brachial plexus squeeze, learned in 2003, refined in a schoolhouse in Fallujah, muscle memory that never forgot. Enough pressure to immobilize him completely. Not enough to cause permanent damage. The calculation was automatic. For seconds from the moment she moved to the moment the man lay completely still, barely breathing, his nervous system overloaded and compliant. Security. Now, Margaret said. Her voice was absolutely steady. It was someone else's voice, someone from a different life, a different woman, a woman who gave orders and expected them to be followed immediately. 3 guards rushed in with restraints, their movements suddenly purposeful now that the actual threat had been neutralized by a woman they'd never seen move faster than a walk down the hallway. Dr. Hassan gasped on the floor, his hand at his throat, purple fading back toward human skin tone. Alive! His oxygen was already coming back. She could see the awareness returning to his eyes. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway. He had watched every second of it. Margaret saw his face go through the sequence like watching a film reel, shock first, then something that looked like calculation, then something darker. His eyes went to her hands, which were steady. His eyes went to her positioning, which was military precise. His eyes went to her face, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw something that made him take a half step back. He didn't thank her. He didn't ask if anyone was injured. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and started dialing before the guards had even finished securing the restrained man's second wrist. Margaret helped Dr. Hassan to his feet. His hand was still on his throat, fingers checking to see if everything was still connected. His eyes focused on her, and she watched the moment of confused recognition start to form in his pupils. He had seen her before. He remembered something. Something old. Something from a place that didn't exist in his conscious memory anymore but lived in his nervous system like a scar. Have we met? His voice was hoarse, damaged from the strangling, but the accent was there, the careful American pronunciation sitting over something older, something Middle Eastern. Margaret's face went blank. Not the blank of emptiness but the blank of a door sliding shut. I don't think so, doctor. You should get checked out. Tracheal damage. Have radiology get a soft tissue neck film. Rule out laryngeal fracture. She was already walking away, her heart rate still elevated but controlled, her breathing steady, her hands no longer trembling. The trembling would come later. In private. In the darkness of the supply closet on the third floor where no one could see. Behind her, she heard one of the security guards say, "Who the hell was that?" and another voice answer, "I don't know, but I'm never parking in her spot." Dr. Hargrove was still on the phone, his voice low and urgent, saying things like excessive force and undisclosed capabilities, and we need to talk about that nurse, the one on night shift. His voice carried the sound of someone already calculating how to weaponize what he had just witnessed. Margaret reached the supply room and let the door close quietly behind her. Around her, boxes of bandages and 4 fluids and trauma shears arranged in perfect rows. She pressed her palm against the cold metal shelf and let herself breathe. Just breathe. Just be the quiet nurse for a few more minutes. The phone in her scrub pocket buzzed. A text from an unknown number, security footage from ER at 3:27 a.m. has been flagged for review. Standard protocol. You'll be contacted. It was the administrator, the one who reported to Hargrove, the one who did what Hargrove asked without asking questions. Margaret deleted the text without responding. She knew what was coming. She had felt it the moment her hands moved on their own. The moment she became visible. The moment she stopped being invisible. The intruder's arm came up with the tire iron, but Margaret was already moving. Muscle memory took over, 20 years collapsed into for seconds. She pivoted left, letting his momentum carry him past her, then redirected his weight downward using his own force against him. His body hit the linoleum hard. Air exploded from his lungs. She was on him before he could breathe, her knee locked on his spine, her hands finding pressure points with the precision of someone who'd done this in desert heat while rounds snapped overhead. Her breathing stayed controlled. Clinical. Just another patient to stabilize. Security arrived 60 seconds later, radios crackling, boots thundering down the corridor. They found Margaret kneeling on the subdued intruder, her hand steady as surgical steel, her eyes tracking his respiratory rate like she was monitoring a ventilator. The man was conscious but immobilized, unable to move without her permission. One of the security guards, an ex-Marine named Torres, stopped dead. He'd seen combat restraint before. This wasn't security protocol. This was something else entirely. Margaret released him only when Torres gave the signal, and even then she did it in stages, releasing pressure on one point while maintaining control on another, lowering him to full prone position with the care of someone preventing further injury. Only when he was fully restrained did she stand, her movements economical and without drama. She didn't dust herself off. She didn't announce what she'd done. She simply turned and walked back toward the ER entrance, where Dr. Amir Hassan stood with his hand on his throat, staring at her with something between gratitude and shock. But Hargrove was watching from the ER entrance, and his face had gone through for distinct expressions in those for seconds. Shock. Recognition. Calculation. Fury. He'd seen what Margaret did. More importantly, he'd seen what it meant. This wasn't a nurse who knew how to defend herself. This was someone trained. Someone dangerous. Someone who'd just made him look like a coward in front of his entire staff. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she'd just signed her own termination papers. Hargrove pulled out his phone at 6:03 a.m., while the sun was still bleeding orange across the Houston skyline. Board member Richardson answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. Hargrove didn't bother with greetings. "We have a liability situation at Oak Creek. Nurse Margaret Walsh just assaulted a patient experiencing a mental health crisis. No authorization. No proper de-escalation training. Worse, she's disclosed nothing about combat training on her employment application. We're exposed." Richardson was awake now. "What kind of combat training?" "I don't know yet. But she took down a 250-pound intruder in 4 seconds like she was trained by the military. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. We need to move fast before she hires a lawyer." By 10 a.m., Hargrove had placed calls to all 3 of Margaret's employment references. To each one, he used the same script, routine background verification. Nothing to worry about. Just standard HR process. "Tell me, has Margaret ever disclosed military experience? Has she ever mentioned combat training? Any history of violence or aggression?" He let the insinuation hang. Each reference, uncertain and wanting to be helpful, said no. But the seed was planted. By noon, an HR investigator named Patricia Hollis had arrived at Oak Creek. She was thin, with dead eyes and a folder already thick with notes Hargrove had prepared for her. She was from a firm that owed Hargrove favors. He'd helped their CEO's daughter get into medical school after her MCAT scores suggested she had no business applying. Hollis didn't ask questions about why the investigation was happening. She simply opened her notebook and began her work. Hargrove had prepared the witnesses. Torres, the security guard, was called in first. Hollis smiled at him, the smile of someone with no actual warmth. "Can you describe what Nurse Walsh did to the patient?" Torres hesitated. He'd been in the Marines. He knew what he'd seen. She subdued him. Fast. Safe restraint. Did he consent to that restraint? He was armed. He was attacking Dr. Hassan. Hollis wrote something down. But did he consent? Torres understood then. He understood what answer she wanted. No. 5 other staff members came through her office. Each one was asked the same question slightly differently. Did Margaret seem aggressive? Did she ever seem uncomfortable with normal protocols? Had she ever seemed like she was more capable than a standard nurse should be? By the time Hollis finished, she had a narrative, a nurse with undisclosed capabilities, possible military background, who'd gone off protocol and assaulted a vulnerable patient. Margaret was called to the HR office at 4:17 p.m. Hollis had the termination letter already prepared. It sat on the desk between them like a knife. Effective immediately. Unsafe patient interaction. Undisclosed physical capabilities that pose a liability risk to hospital operations. Failure to provide complete disclosure on your employment application regarding combat or tactical training. Margaret's hands didn't shake. She read it once, her eyes tracking each word with the same focus she'd used to assess the intruder's respiratory status. I saved Dr. Hassan's life. You assaulted a patient experiencing a mental health crisis. Hollis's voice was flat. Security is trained for situations like that. You're not. Margaret could have argued. She could have told this woman that she was trained beyond what security could imagine, that she'd performed emergency needle decompression on a child in a Baghdad schoolhouse while mortar fire chewed up the walls, that she'd held more lives in her hands than this investigator would see in 10 careers. But that would mean explaining why she knew those things. That would mean opening the door to her past. That would mean destroying the anonymity she'd chosen, the quiet life she'd built to escape the nightmares. She'd walked away from the military to heal. No one knew where she was. Not the VA. Not the Army. Not even her son knew the full story of what she'd done or what it had cost her. She'd chosen Oak Creek Memorial specifically because it was far enough from D.C., far enough from Walter Reed, far enough from anyone who might recognize her. So she said nothing. She stood up and walked out of the office. She cleared her locker in silence while the night shift began their rounds. The cracked coffee mug that Daniel had given her when he was 8, painted with uneven letters that read "World's Best Mom." The dying succulent she kept forgetting to water, its leaves brown and papery. The photograph of her unit in Baghdad, taken in 2004, the faces of 18 people arranged in 3 rows. Half of them were gone now. Not all of them dead, some had just disappeared into civilian life the way Margaret had tried to. But on that photograph, their smiles were still alive. She put them in a cardboard box. She pulled on her jacket. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. At 11:11 p.m., she sat at a rain-soaked bus stop on the corner of Main and Jefferson, the cardboard box on her lap, her worn combat boots visible through the open locker bag beside her, rain soaking through her jacket. Her phone lit up with missed calls from Daniel. 7 of them. She didn't answer. She didn't know what to say to her 17-year-old son. How could she explain that the hospital had fired her? That her past had caught up with her? That the one place she'd finally felt safe was gone? The rain fell harder. Traffic moved past her like she wasn't there. She was invisible again. But this time, it felt like erasure. What she didn't know was that Daniel had already found the showbox under her bed. What she didn't know was that he'd opened it, and that his hands were trembling as he read the citations on the ribbons inside. What she didn't know was that he was about to walk into Oak Creek Memorial and force his mother to stop running. The termination letter arrived on Thursday at 4:47 in the afternoon, printed on hospital letterhead, signed by 3 board members she'd never met. Unsafe patient interaction and undisclosed physical capabilities, it read, each word a stone placed carefully on her chest. The real reason was unspoken, poisonous as gas you can't see. She had made Dr. Hargrove look like a coward. In the moment when a man with a tire iron had been strangling a resident, he had frozen. She had moved. That was the crime. Margaret walked out through the ER entrance carrying a cardboard box someone had left by the staff lockers. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something she hadn't won. Inside the box were the things she'd accumulated across 15 years, a cracked coffee mug from a 2009 surgical conference, a dying succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf, a photograph curling at the edges. In the photo, 5 soldiers stood in Baghdad sunlight, shoulder to shoulder in desert camouflage, their faces young and full of something Margaret had spent 20 years trying to forget. Half of them were gone now. Gone in ways that didn't make the news. Gone in ways that left her the only one still standing. She sat at the bus stop on Richmond Avenue, rain soaking through her jacket, the cardboard box growing soft on her lap. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old plastic grocery bag, were her combat boots, the leather cracked and scarred, the laces still laced the way they'd been when she stopped wearing them in 2003. Her hands shook as she held them. Not from fear. From something else. From the realization that the woman she'd been in Baghdad and the woman sitting at this bus stop in the rain were the same person after all. She'd never actually run far enough. The next morning, while Margaret was still in the apartment staring at her boots, 2 FBI agents walked into Oak Creek Memorial with badges and determination. Special Agent Torres, compact and precise like a surgeon, and Agent Kim, who carried a laptop the way Margaret had once carried a trauma pack. They went directly to the board conference room where Richardson and 3 other board members were reviewing the incident from the day before. "We've been investigating Dr. Hargrove for insurance fraud and medical billing irregularities for 6 weeks, Torres said, placing her badge on the table. The sound was quiet but final, like a surgical clamp closing. This morning, he made a critical mistake. Kim opened the laptop, turned the screen toward the board. Lines of code, timestamps, access logs. Dr. Hargrove attempted to forge Margaret Walsh's personnel records at 11:43 p.m. last night. He added false disciplinary actions to justify her termination. We've been monitoring his database access since April. The room did what rooms do when they realize they're standing on the edge of something. It went very still. Richardson's face went grey. One of the other board members stood up. We also have evidence of Medicare fraud, kickbacks from 3 pharmaceutical companies, and patient dumping to inflate his performance metrics, Kim continued. But the forgery gave us the warrant we needed. Richardson cleared his throat. Dr. Hargrove is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building. What happened next took 45 seconds. Hargrove burst from the administrative office down the hall, saw the agents blocking the corridor, and tried to reverse course. One of the security guards was already moving. The handcuffs made a sound like a key turning in a lock, metal on metal, the sound of doors closing. Torres read him his rights in a voice that was professional and utterly without mercy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. They led him through the hospital corridor at 4 p.m., right in the middle of shift change when the hallways were full. Staff lined both sides like mourners at a funeral that nobody had invited them to. Nurse Chen stood with her arms crossed. Dr. Patel watched with something that looked like satisfaction. Dr. Hassan, the young resident Margaret had resuscitated a month ago, stood beside Commander Price, who had arrived that morning from San Antonio with nothing but his service record and 30 years of testimony about what Margaret Walsh actually was. Hargrove's designer suit was rumpled. His face was the color of hospital walls. He didn't look at anyone as the agents guided him past the line of staff, past the water fountain where he'd once stood triumphantly while talking about reinventing patient metrics, past the bulletin board where her termination had been posted like a public execution. The doors at the emergency entrance slid open, not with the usual pneumatic hiss but with a sound like finality, like a page turning that would never turn back. The FBI vehicle waited at the curb. Hargrove was ducked into the back seat and the vehicle moved into traffic without ceremony. Richardson appeared in the staff area at 5:15. Margaret had been called back to the hospital specifically for this moment, and she stood in her old scrubs, the one she'd picked up from her locker on her way in, while the board's senior member approached her. His hands were steady but his voice had aged 10 years in the past 24 hours. "We'd like to offer you the position of head of trauma training," he said. "We need someone who understands crisis response. Someone who understands what it means to keep people alive when everything is falling apart. We need you." Commander Price stood at the end of the corridor, a man with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd sent soldiers into places where the margin between survival and death was measured in seconds. He nodded once. Daniel was there too, Margaret's 17-year-old son, grinning like he'd already won something that mattered. And in Margaret's hand, visible now in the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, was the cardboard box containing her worn combat boots, her cracked coffee mug, her dying succulent, and her photograph of 5 soldiers in Baghdad sunlight. Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath a person takes when they're about to stop pretending. "I accept," she said. 2 years later, her boots were on the shelf in her office where everyone could see them. Not hidden. Not ashamed. Just there, leather cracked and laces worn, visible to every resident who walked through the trauma training center Margaret had rebuilt from memory and muscle and the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from having held a man's life together with your hands while sand blew across a courtyard in Baghdad and you were 22 years old and nobody had told you it would stay with you like this. She was teaching a class on crisis response when Dr. Hassan knocked on the glass wall. 12 residents watched as he entered, and Margaret didn't need to explain who this young physician was or why he moved with a kind of gratitude that didn't require words. She'd told him the story 6 months into her new position, had shown him his own medical file from August 2003, the pediatric patient brought to the field hospital in a school uniform, the one she'd resuscitated using needle decompression for a tension pneumothorax that shouldn't have worked but did. He'd listened with tears running down his face and then he'd said, "Chief, I'm standing here because of you," and that was the moment Margaret had finally understood that running wasn't the same as hiding. The residents practiced pressure point releases on training dummies while Margaret circulated, adjusting posture, correcting technique. One of the younger nurses, fresh from her RN certification, asked, "Chief Walsh, how did you learn this? This isn't in any textbook." Margaret paused beside her, hand on the dummy's shoulder. Some things you learn because you have to. Because people are dying and your job is to keep them alive long enough for the actual doctors to fix them. It wasn't a request. It was the truth. At 3:45, Margaret closed the training center and walked through the halls of Oak Creek Memorial with her posture straight and her head level. Night shift nurses greeted her by name and asked for advice on difficult patients. A resident requested her signature on a certification. The morning charge nurse mentioned that they needed to talk about staffing for the new trauma unit Margaret was building. She belonged here now, fully, visibly, completely. Both the warrior and the healer. No longer hiding either one. Across the city in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table with a banner reading discount insurance, low rates. His medical license was permanently revoked. He was bankrupt from legal fees. A customer walked past without stopping. Hargrove saw the customer's phone screen as they passed, a news article about Margaret Walsh receiving the Houston Healthcare Hero Award. He looked away. That evening, Margaret stood in her office and touched the boots on her shelf, remembering sand and blood and a child who shouldn't have survived. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, now pre-med at University of Houston, telling her he'd aced his anatomy exam. Another message from Commander Price, proud of you, Senior Chief. Always have been. She looked at the framed photograph on her desk, the same one that had been face down in that cardboard box at the rain-soaked bus stop. 5 soldiers in Baghdad sunlight. Now she could look at them without breaking. Margaret Walsh, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Trauma Instructor, the woman who'd once resuscitated a child in a schoolhouse and watched him grow up to become a physician, walked through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors as night fell. The night shift was starting, the building settling into its quiet rhythm of monitors beeping and ventilators breathing and nurses moving through the dark like keepers of light. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and let us know in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet people are often the most dangerous ones. And tell me, would you have walked away, or would you have saved him like Margaret did?